Hello, my little rain clouds. I wanted to talk about self-blame and guilt. A lot of people carry around an awful lot of guilt and self-blame, and often it's for things that they haven't even done, or they're assigning too much responsibility to themselves for what happened. That's particularly the case in abuse and trauma. But even if you are genuinely responsible for something bad happening, a lot of people tend to really overdo it with the guilt and the self-blame, and they will punish themselves and they will get stuck, trapped in unhealthy cycles that benefit nobody. So I think it's really important to be able to heal from that and to be able to kind of challenge those patterns and the beliefs that we have about them. So guilt and self-blame can be helpful and appropriate in moderation. If you have genuinely done something bad, then self-blame can help you acknowledge and take responsibility for what you did and what happened. And guilt can help to motivate you to change your behavior so that you don't do it again. Let's say that you went to a party and you got drunk and you drove your car home, and while driving drunk, you hit someone with your car, killing them. That is a terrible thing. And it is very likely that you would feel a tremendous amount of guilt for what you did. You know that what you did was wrong. You're aware that it's breaking the law. You recognize, the tremendous cost of taking a life, and you would feel guilt. You would feel, I have done a bad thing. My actions were bad. You would hopefully be able to identify your responsibility in what happened and would assign blame to yourself for what happened. You may also feel a sense of shame. Shame is different to guilt. Guilt is typically what I did or didn't do was bad, whereas shame tends to be I am bad. Who or what I am is bad. And typically we want to try and hide that from people because we worry that if they become aware of who we are, then they will judge us, they will reject us, they might hurt us, etc. Guilt is typically not as crippling as shame, but the two can go hand in hand. And you may feel quite a bit of shame for what you did, for driving drunk and killing a person. The self-blame and the guilt are appropriate in that situation and can be helpful. The shame, not so much. And it's important in our recovery from something like that we are able to accept what happened, but also kind of distance ourselves from what happened. Recognize that the thing that we did, the thing that happened, isn't who we are. It's not the entirety of our being. We are multifaceted, complex people, and this doesn't have to define us. So it's important to be able to kind of distinguish between the action that was bad and the person who was not bad. We need to take responsibility for what we did. We can accept that what we did was bad, and we can try and change our behavior so that we don't do that thing again. For instance, in the case of the drunk driving, you may decide, first of all, that you're never going to drive while drunk. You might also recognize, you know what, I don't really like being drunk and potentially being out of control and doing things that I regret, so I'm actually just not going to drink alcohol anymore. That may or may not be a thing that you decide to do, but the guilt may motivate you to change your behavior. Certainly, I would hope if you were drunk and the prospect of driving came up, the guilt would remind you of what happened before and motivate you to not do that thing again. Although in regards to being drunk, it's kind of tricky because your judgment tends to become impaired. But I would say in most cases, guilt can be very helpful to motivate us to change our behavior. And the self-blame can be helpful so that we acknowledge what part we played in what happened. And in the case of the drunk driving, we played a very large role. We played the central role. We were directly responsible for doing something that caused harm to another person. But in a different situation, it might not be so clear-cut. Let's say that you're at home and you decide to go out and go shopping, and you happen to leave the door unlocked when you go out. And then when you come back, it turns out that someone has broken into your house and stolen some of your stuff. And so when you come back and you see that you've been broken into, you remember, oh, I left the door unlocked. Oh, this happened because I left the door unlocked. And you blame yourself for what happened. It's important to recognize that blame and responsibility aren't black and white things. It's not all or nothing. You don't deserve 100% of the responsibility in that situation because someone else played a big role in what happened. The person who stole your stuff, the person who decided, who made a conscious decision to break into your house, break the law, and steal your stuff, bears a huge amount of responsibility. You not leaving the door locked, you might take some responsibility for that. What you did or didn't do in this case led to a kind of opportunity. You lowered the entry barrier. You made it easier for this person to commit a crime and steal your stuff. But you are not responsible directly for what happened. The person who decided to steal is responsible for that. What you did was just an enabler of sorts. But you might be tempted to blame yourself, to assign 100% of the blame to yourself for not locking the door. This is particularly common in trauma and abuse. And I think that the reason why people tend to do this is because they want to feel safe. You may have heard this common saying in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think when these kinds of things happen, we want to try and flip that around and say, well, if I have all the responsibility, then I also have all the power. If it was entirely my fault that I got robbed, then that means if I change what I do, if I make sure that I always leave the door locked, I'll never be robbed. I'll be safe. We assign way too much, 100% of the responsibility to ourselves for something that happened so that we can feel a sense of control and power and safety. Because we don't really want to acknowledge that there's dangerous stuff out there in the world and that things are kind of unpredictable and that bad stuff might just happen sometimes without us having control over it. So if I'm the one that's at fault for this bad thing that happened to me, then I can stop it happening again by changing my behavior. So a lot of people, particularly victims of abuse, will blame themselves, and they will blame themselves entirely. Their abusers get off scot-free. No responsibility there. No responsibility on the person who decided, who chose to do the wrong thing and hurt someone. All the responsibility goes onto the victim, which is not fair at all. It's very hurtful, and it makes recovery so difficult when someone blames themselves for something that someone else did to them. The feeling of safety that we get from blaming ourselves also isn't real. It's not actual safety. It's an illusion of safety. Because if I'm blaming myself for what happened, then I'm ignoring the very real culprit of who did this thing. I'm ignoring all of the responsibility that someone else bears. all of the power and the agency and the choice that they had in what happened. If I'm not taking the appropriate precautions, if I'm not being aware that someone might do this again, and the risk factors, I'm actually leaving myself exposed to danger. If I'm blaming myself for not locking the door, I'm ignoring the fact that someone came up to the door and tried to open it. Whether the door was locked or unlocked, they might still have broken in. They already had the intent to break in. It might not have just been a crime of opportunity where they happened to try the door and it happened to be unlocked, and so they decided to help themselves. They might have intentionally been breaking into my house regardless. And if the door was locked, they might have just picked the lock or broken the door or broken the window or something. So if I'm taking responsibility, I might get broken into again because I'm thinking that I'm going to be safe if I lock the door, when actually I might need to step back and look at the bigger problem. Yeah, I might have some of the responsibility on me, maybe a little bit, but I'm not the one who broke into my house. So we need to place the responsibility on the burglar as well. Much more of the responsibility on the burglar. And we can broaden that too. We can look at the socio-economic factors that contributed to this person committing a crime in the first place. Maybe poverty and the justice system and things like that played a role in them deciding to do this. Maybe their circumstances and some of the systems in society, the problems that we have, are also to blame. Maybe some of the responsibility should go onto them. Maybe my neighbors might bear some responsibility if they saw what happened and decided not to do anything about it. There could be all sorts of other factors that might bear some responsibility as well. At the very least, it shouldn't all be on me. And even if I want to believe in that fairy tale, that sense of safety where if I lock the door, I'm going to be immune to all robberies and nothing bad's going to happen, I'm going to be at risk of more danger. So I need to be aware that there's actually a lot more to this situation, even if that's kind of scary. So ask yourself, this thing that you're blaming yourself for, are you actually that responsible? How much responsibility do you bear? It's probably not 100%. It might be high if you did genuinely do a thing that was bad, but are you maybe inflating that responsibility to give yourself some sense of power or control or safety? Is it possible that someone else shifted the responsibility and blame onto you? Perhaps an abuser wanted to make you feel like you had done the wrong thing. Perhaps someone else was responsible for something but didn't want to take the blame, so they put it on you. If you genuinely did do something wrong, ask yourself, how much of the responsibility do I bear, and who else might bear some? And if you did genuinely do something bad and you bear some responsibility, then ask yourself, have I learned from this? Has my guilt made me behave differently? Have I changed my behavior? Am I going to do the same thing again? The answer is probably not. So, if you've already learned from this thing, do you really need to punish yourself for it? What is that punishment doing? Studies have shown us, time and again, that punishment is not really a very effective way to teach people. If you want someone to not do something, it's typically more effective to just talk to them and explain what's going on and why that's not a good thing to do, ask them to change. Punishment doesn't tend to teach someone not to do a thing. It tends to teach them not to get caught. We want to avoid the punishment, but we won't necessarily change our behavior. the guilt that we feel tends to be more effective at changing our behavior and motivating us to behave differently. And it's likely that you've already learned the lesson. You've already learned not to do the thing that you feel guilty for. So the punishment doesn't really have any purpose in that regard. You're not actually learning anything. You're not reinforcing a change in behavior because you've already decided whether you're going to do that thing or not. I don't think the punishment is going to change that. So beating yourself up for a past mistake or a thing that you did that you regret, it's not actually helpful. The other reason that people tend to punish themselves, though, is because they feel like they're bad and that this is some sort of retribution, some way of making it better. But the thing about that is that this well of self-loathing and guilt and self-blame, it doesn't ever tend to run dry. It doesn't matter how much you punish yourself, you're never going to feel worthy of redemption or forgiveness if you keep going through that cycle, if you stick to that mentality, if you maintain those beliefs about yourself. What we actually need to do is to find redemption, is to make amends, to make things better. If you hurt someone with what you did or what you didn't do, then typically you need to talk to them and express your remorse for what you did and what happened. You need to show that you're sorry, that you're not going to do that thing again, that your behavior has changed, and then see if you can make amends somehow, if you can make it up to them. And that varies based on what we did and who was affected. Going back to Spider-Man. I don't know if you're familiar with Spider-Man's origin story. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. Basically, Spider-Man was performing in some kind of a show, and he kind of gets stiffed on the money. He doesn't get paid as much money as he was meant to. And he gets a bit pissed off. And then a robber happens to come by and rob the place. They didn't give Spider-Man his money. And Spider-Man could easily stop the robber. But he doesn't, because he's feeling kind of petty. He's like, well, I'm not going to help you then. So the robber steals the money, gets away, looks for a getaway car, and happens to kill someone while he's trying to get the getaway car. And the person he kills is Spider-Man's uncle, Uncle Ben, who's like a father to him. And Spider-Man there recognizes that he had some responsibility in what happened. He didn't kill his uncle. That's important to note. The robber actively made a choice to kill Spider-Man's uncle. He didn't know it was Spider-Man's uncle, but still, he made a choice to do that. But Spider-Man enabled him to do that by not taking action, by not stopping the robber when he could have. It's an act of omission. He didn't do a thing and indirectly allowed a bad thing to happen. And so he recognizes his responsibility, and he feels guilt, and he feels self-blame. And instead of wallowing in self-hatred and self-loathing, instead of punishing himself, instead of assigning 100% of the blame to himself and getting stuck in this very negative, hurtful, self-destructive cycle, Spider-Man decides that he's going to dedicate his life to fighting crime. He's going to use his powers responsibly, and he's going to help people and make the world a better place. And in doing so, he finds redemption, and he finds a way to make amends for what he did. And he is able to alleviate some of his guilt in doing so. And that's really important, because self-blame can be helpful in moderation, but too much of it, and we get caught in this self-destructive cycle where we're not making the world a better place, we're just hurting ourselves. We're putting more negativity into the world, we're causing more hurt, more pain, and we might convince ourselves that it's justified or warranted, that we deserve this, but we don't. There's no benefit to anyone for just beating ourselves up, for hurting ourselves, for doing self-destructive things. It doesn't make the world a better place. if you truly believe that you need punishment more, if you need some way of making amends, if you need to pay for what you did or what happened, then do it in a positive way. What are some ways that you can do that aren't self-destructive? Often, ways of making amends can be financial support or donating to charity, helping the financially underprivileged. It can be volunteering with charitable organizations. It can be goodwill and outreach. It can be community service. It can be teaching people, sharing things that you've learned, sharing the lessons and wisdom that you've gained from your mistakes and your regrets. You can do all sorts of things, and it varies based on what you did and what the circumstances were. For example, the drunk driving example, you might work with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or you might try and talk to people who are at risk of abusing alcohol and try to steer them on a better path. Whatever you end up doing to make amends or finding redemption, it doesn't erase what you did or what happened. And we don't forget about that. We don't wipe it away. But we can point back to it and say, this is what set me on a better path. And something good has come from this. That through this, I've found value and purpose and meaning. I've been able to construct something positive out of what was horrible. You don't need to hurt yourself. You don't need to uselessly punish yourself. It does no one any good. You don't need to burn yourself alive in the flames of guilt. You can use them to power yourself forward, to find motivation and drive to do good things. You can forge new meaning out of something that happened before. And in time, you will hopefully learn to forgive yourself. You will recognize that you have changed, that you are not the person that you were when that thing happened, that you have grown, that you have learned, and that you have become more, and that you have used it to make the world a better place. Be kind to yourself, and try to forgive yourself. Until next time, my little rain clouds. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.